should the devil want to steal my soul? This wretched, all lonesome, and this need to be whole. Just a lost little puppy, always looking for a home. Why should the devil want to steal my soul? My mama told me that the devil likes to dance, dressed up in the shadows, always looking for his chance.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. My name is Rebecca Hoogs, and I am the Executive Director of Seattle Arts and Lectures. Welcome to the 38th season of Seattle Arts and Lectures. We're so delighted to welcome you to an evening with Bill McKibben.
Take a bite out of both the climate crisis and the crisis of authoritarianism on this earth. And that one big good thing is this very sudden, very rapid surge in clean energy around the earth. Now, in some ways, I feel like bringing news of solar to Seattle is the kind of rough equivalent of bringing coals to Newcastle. This is a place that has played a big role in the switch, the turn towards clean energy. I've watched for years as friends of mine like Casey Golden have made it possible for people in the Northwest to imagine a different path forward. And there has been no public official in the whole country who's done more than Jay Inslee to help push this vision forward. So, that said, I still find, there was an excerpt from this book in the New Yorker earlier this summer, and the reaction that I got the most from people, even people who are very deeply involved in climate and energy, was, I had no idea. I had no idea how fast this was going. Because in the last 36 months, things have really and dramatically changed. The numbers are staggering. In May, which is the last month for which we have good numbers, the Chinese were building 8 gigawatts of solar, 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. Gigawatt being the rough equivalent of a large coal-fired power plant. So they were putting up one of those out of solar panels every 8 hours, China, you've heard of petrostates. China is fast becoming the first electro-state on planet Earth. But parts of this country, too, not just Washington with the remarkable work going on at Hanford and elsewhere, but California. California reached some kind of tipping point over the last 15 months or so. Now, almost every day in California, they produce more than 100% of the energy they use from clean energy for long stretches of the day. When the sun goes down at night, the biggest source of supply to the grid is usually batteries that have been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon, batteries that did not exist on that grid 3 years ago. The bottom line in California, and this is the most encouraging statistic I think I've heard in the 40 years that I've been at work on the climate crisis, California is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity this summer than they were 2 years ago. California, recall, is the 4th largest economy in the world, okay? So that's the kind of number that spread widely and quickly would begin not to stop global warming, it is too late for that, but to begin to shave tenths of a degree off how hot the planet eventually gets. And a tenth of a degree Celsius, remember, every tenth of a degree Celsius moves another 100 million of our brothers and sisters from a safe climate zone into a dangerous one. So there's nothing more important that we could be doing. And we start seeing this happen not just in California, The state that's now producing clean energy faster than any other in this country, and by a pretty large margin, is the state of Texas, which is also, of course, the world headquarters of the hydrocarbon industry. And they were doing their best this year to try and rein in the expansion of sun and wind in Texas. They introduced a bunch of bills in the state legislature that people thought would pass, the most prominent of which everybody was calling DEI for natural gas, because it would have forced anybody who wanted to put up 5 megawatts of solar to also put up 5 megawatts of gas-fired power I think in an effort to keep gas from becoming sad and discouraged. And people appeared out of the woodwork, mostly from rural Texas, to say, do not do this. This is how we pay for our schools now. This is what keeps the old folks' home open in our community. And the state legislature backed away. They returned to their project of redistricting Texas to help Mr. Trump and left clean energy alone. All of this is happening, of course, because we crossed about 5 years ago some invisible line. At that point, producing energy from the sun and the wind became cheaper than producing it from burning coal and gas and oil. And now that was an epochal moment. It was long in coming. Well, not that long. I mean, the solar cell was only invented in 1954 in Edison, New Jersey at Bell Labs, which means that there's probably somebody in this room old enough to have helped fund that work by putting dimes in payphones back in the day, you know. And we had our first chance, you know, of making it really go in the 1970s in this country during the oil crisis, when Jimmy Carter, engineer, decided that it was the way out and put solar panels on the roof and put money in his budget as the announced goal was enough R&D to make sure that America was producing 20% of its power from the sun by the year 2000. Had we done that, we would live on a very different planet, a much cooler one. We didn't. We elected Ronald Reagan. He took the solar panels off the roof and scotched that spending and started the sort of drill thing we've spent the intervening decades doing. The next people who took it up were our colleagues in the environmental fight in Germany, who at the turn of the century, when the Greens held the balance of power in their parliamentary system, used that leverage to demand what the Germans call the Energiewende, the energy transition. The German government was willing to pay pretty hefty sum of money to people who put solar panels on their roof and sold it back to the grid. That created the demand that allowed the Chinese to start to get very good at building solar panels. And they got better and better and better until we reached that point. And once we crossed that line, once we hit the moment when the cheapest way to make power on our Earth was to point a sheet of glass at the sun, that allowed this rocket-like takeoff to begin. It took us from 1954 until 2022 to put the first terawatt of solar power on this planet. It took 2 years to get the second terawatt on the planet. We've just passed, I think, number 3 in about 13 months, okay? The planet generates 30% more power from the sun this summer than last summer, okay? Which is remarkable to think about. But not fast enough. Not fast enough because at exactly the same time as I have described, the world's climate is breaking down in real time. We're in a race, and it's a race we're still losing. But this is the first tool that we have had that scales fast enough to make some difference in that race. And so we need to seize it and run with it and push it as hard as we can, which is what I really want to talk with you about tonight, about how to think about and how to push for this just as hard as we can, especially in this country, which lags behind every other nation on earth. It's not hard to understand what's going on right now in Washington. You'll recall that last year, then candidate Trump told fossil fuel executives in a not very secret meeting that in return for $1 billion, it was a sort of Austin Powers moment, $1 billion in campaign donations, they could have anything they wanted. They came up with about $500 million between donations and advertising expenses and lobbying expenses in the last election cycle. And that was enough because they're now getting everything they could ever have hoped for and really more. I mean, we're doing things that are crazier than anything we've ever done as a nation. 2 weeks ago, the president ordered a halt to work on a 90% complete wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island. Offered no reason other than that we didn't like wind, but I mean, that's crazy. If it stands, 1,000 years from now, archaeologists will be scratching their heads trying to figure out why there's a collection of strange pylons off the New England coast with, they'll wonder if there was some odd religious cult that had, and the answer will be basically yes. On and on and on. The fossil fuel industry, I mean, if I know that California is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity, you can be sure that the people at Exxon and Chevron know that too. They understand this for what it is, an existential moment, and so they fight with everything they have. And so we need to fight with the tools that we have to try and push forward this moment. And I don't think that it's an impossible fight at all. I told you about Texas, and that's very interesting news, and it's not the only story like that. Let me tell you another one. Across Europe in the last 3 years, 3 or 4 million Europeans who live in apartments and hence have no roof of their own have adopted what we call balcony solar. They go to whatever you call Best Buy in Brussels and they plunk down a few €100 and they come home with a solar panel designed to hang over the railing of their balcony. It just plugs into the wall with a standard plug. You don't need an electrician, you don't need wiring, and often it produces 20 or 25% of the power that the household uses. Now that's illegal everywhere in the US, except that progressive bastion, the state of Utah, which earlier this year, by a unanimous vote of both houses of the state legislature, passed enabling legislation allowing people to do this. The state senator, Republican, who sponsored all this and who I've talked to, just stood up and said, if this is good enough for the people of Stuttgart, why not the people of Provo, And for that matter, why not the people of Bellevue and Walla Walla and wherever else? This is one of the things that we're pushing hard for as we move towards Sunday, on this coming Sunday, 5 days hence. There'll be 500 or so events all across the country, including some wonderful ones here close to home, all designed in part to drive home the message that even though we can't do anything in Washington right now, there's all sorts of stuff we can do at state legislatures and city halls. You know, it costs 3 times as much to put solar on your roof in America as it does in Australia or the EU. It's not because the panels are more expensive. Tariffs are a little fraction of a cost, but mostly it's because we have too much bureaucracy around this. Every single municipality in America, all 15,000, have their own building code, their own team of inspectors. It can take months to get this stuff up and running. Not needed. There's an app for it. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory developed it a couple of years ago, Solar App Plus. The contractor just types in what kind of equipment he's putting on what address. If the computer likes it, it gives him an instant permit to go to work. California, Maryland, and now New Jersey have mandated its use. It's time for everybody to be doing the same thing. But the other thing that day, Sunday, is going to be about is, as Rebecca said, driving home the message that we need to think a little differently about all this. For 40 years, we have filed this stuff away in our brains under a folder marked alternative energy, and that's, by this point, had the kind of effect of marginalizing it in our minds. It is not alternative energy. It is the obvious, common sense, straightforward way to power the world. 95% of new electric generation on planet Earth last year came from the sun and the wind and batteries. And that is what we have to get people to understand. Since I'm a big fan of Kirkland, my beloved grandfather almost 100 years ago was the mayor of Kirkland, back when it was a little shipbuilding town that you had to take a ferry to get to. Since I'm a big fan of it, the analogy I've been using with people is we've been thinking of solar power as the kind of Whole Foods of energy, you know, nice but pricey for special people. In fact, it is the Costco of energy. It is cheap, it's available in bulk, it's on the shelf ready to go, okay? And if we can get that message through, then the politics get easier and easier. Because the politics are interesting already. I've lived my life in rural America, some of it in blue state and some of it in red state America, always out on dirt roads. So I have lots of neighbors who, you know, fly their Trump flags and things, and a surprising number of them have solar panels on their roofs. And when I talk with them about it, they usually say some version of the same thing. My home is my castle, which I am prepared to defend with my AR-15, and it's a better castle if it has an independent power supply up on the roof, you know? And I'm American enough to feel that same sense, you know? Not so much the AR-15 part, but the rest. I like the idea of being independent in some way from some of the powers that be. Those are the kind of differences that we can work with, especially because the advantages of moving in this direction are so manifest and so beautiful. Most powerfully, I think, they're obvious for the people who live in the poorest parts of the world. I was talking about Pakistan before. Pakistan suffered harder from climate change than any country on earth. We've had in 2010 and 2022 the 2 biggest floods since Noah. It now routinely reaches 125, 126 degrees in their cities in the summer, at the very edge of human survival. But they do have one geographical advantage. They have a long border with China. And across that border in the last year or so have begun to flow in great volume the cheap solar panels that Chinese factories are capable of producing in enormous numbers. Last year, early in 2024, people who were kind of watching energy systems noticed something weird happening in Pakistan. Demand for electricity on the grid was dropping, and fairly sharply. This never happens. Absent COVID, demand for energy just goes up and up and up. It's part of the human condition, at least so far. They couldn't figure out what was going on until people started to look at images on Google Earth. And then you could see across the rooftops of Lahore and Karachi and Islamabad, solar panels just spreading like mushrooms after a rainstorm. This was not a government program. This was people on their own, tired of expensive and unreliable energy from the grid, buying Chinese solar panels, going on TikTok and YouTube to look at videos with Hindustani music in the background about how to snap them together. In 8 months, they built the equivalent of half the country's national electric grid, just out of solar panels. Those of you who've traveled in rural Asia know that the soundtrack of that part of the world is the hum or the cough of diesel generators pumping up water from the deep tube wells, that they're the irrigation supply, the kind of residue of the green revolution of the 1960s. That diesel's often the biggest cost that small farmers have. So these guys were early adopters. For the most part, they lacked the money to build the kind of metal stanchions that we're used to seeing. They were just laying panels flat on the ground and pointing them at the sun. But Pakistanis used 35% less diesel last year than they did the year before. Now this same thing is starting to happen across Africa. Anywhere these Chinese trade routes go, there's this flow of solar panels. And it's remarkable to see, and remarkable to see that all the things that come with the supply of cheap electricity, clean electricity, are following right behind. The batteries that have gone down in price just as fast as the panels and the wind turbines, but also the appliances to make use of it. Probably most dramatically, the EV. We're used to thinking of Detroit as the center of the automotive industry, but that is no longer anywhere close to true. It's 2 or 3 cities in China with names that are difficult for me to pronounce, but that are turning out in bulk the best and cheapest cars on the planet, and now quickly selling them across the developing world in enormous numbers. And even better than the EV, and even more units being moved, is the e-bike, which is maybe the most revolutionary of all the things that come with this. Bicycle's a good thing in and of itself, but now we've invented a bicycle without hills, you know? And you can run it for about 1/5 of a cent worth of electricity per mile. Really, there's nothing that humans have ever done that says you can go 5 miles on a penny's worth of electricity, you know? That's astonishing. But it's astonishing, too, just to think about what kind of world it might be on the other side of fossil fuel. Forget climate change for a moment, something I'm always happy to do because it's depressing to think about. And instead, just think about what kind of world we would have inhabited in the last 75 or 100 years if oil had been of trivial value in that period. Think of how many wars and coups and assassination attempts and terrorist plots and things we would have averted. Human beings are altogether too good at coming up with reasons to fight wars, but it'll be difficult to figure out how to start one over sunshine. All the more so because There's nothing we can do, I think, that would begin to erode the bases of the grotesque inequality that now marks this planet than begin to make this transition. If we think about where the modern oligarch came from, the first example is John D. Rockefeller, because he figured out that if you controlled this thing that was so crucial, that was a ticket to wealth and power. As long as we rely on energy sources that are scarce and concentrated in a few places, the people who control those places end up with way too much power. Our biggest oil and gas barons in the last quarter century were the Koch brothers. They controlled more refining and pipeline capacity than anyone else, and they used their winnings to systematically degrade our democracy. If you're wondering why it was so easy for Donald Trump to kick over the foundations of that democracy, it's because they've been systematically rotted from the inside for the last few decades. In Europe, the biggest oil and gas baron is Vladimir Putin, who's using his winnings at the moment to test the defenses of Poland with drones. That should send a chill down the spine of anyone who remembers the history of the 20th century. So imagine a world where everybody can supply the energy that their community needs from resources that are available to them where they are. That's a different world. It's not an absolutely free lunch, you know? There are no free lunches. But there are definitely more expensive and less expensive lunches. And this falls into the latter category. We do need to go do some mining to make it happen. And mining is, though we should do it as humanely and environmentally soundly as we can, gouging the face of the earth to get minerals is never going to be a pleasant business. But if we do this, we have to do a lot less of that mining. Think about the difference for a minute just to get it in your heads. If you go get some lithium out of the ground and you put it in a battery, there it sits for a quarter century doing its job. If the battery degrades, we now know how to recycle that lithium, and it's valuable enough that we'll do it. And you start again. If you go mine some coal, what do? You set it on fire, and then you have to go mine some more tomorrow. That's why the Rocky Mountain Institute, Amory Lovin's old shop, did a study last September saying that they thought that all the mining required for the kind of battery renewable transition by mid-century would require less mining than the volume of coal we mined last year on this earth. A way to think about this is a boatload of solar panels will, in its lifetime, produce 500 times as much energy as a boatload of coal. These are very different things. And think, too, about the 9 million people a year on this planet who die. 1 death in 5 from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel, mostly those particulates that lodge in the lungs and cause all kinds of problems. There are 5 million school children in Delhi. 2.5 million of them have irreversible lung damage just from breathing the air. We listened to that beautiful poem from Daphne earlier tonight. And it's a reminder that nobody, no kid should have to live with that kind of damage. And we don't need to anymore because we know the way forward. Human beings have been deeply involved in the work of combustion for at least 700,000 years or so, the archaeologists tell us. And mostly to the good. You know, we learned to cook food. That gave us the big brain. Once we had fire, we could move north and south from the equator. No one was living in Seattle before fire. The anthropologists even think that standing around the campfire every night for eons produced some of the social bonds that mark our species. It was a kind of proto-Zoom, you know. And then we learned to control its combustion of coal and gas and oil, and that was the Industrial Revolution, and that was modernity. That's the world that we inhabit. But now we can't any longer deal with the side effects of that, and we don't need to. We have the wit to make full use of the power that streams from the sun, and that's not just economic, and not just utilitarian, and not just practical, and not just necessary. It's also quite beautiful. I stole the title of this book, obviously, from George Harrison. And when I went to Spotify to look it up, it turns out that Here Comes the Sun is by far the most streamed song out of the Beatles' vast catalog of music. Twice as many people a day listen to it as listen to Hey Jude or Let It Be or something. And I think it's because in this very dark moment, that kind of gentle and optimistic song is something that people want to hear, but I think it's also because the sun has a deep connection with us. We did a playlist for Sunday, and there were hundreds of songs to choose from. Everybody's Stevie Wonder, Bill Withers, you know, on and on and on down a long, beautiful list. The playlist of songs about fracking is quite short, it must be said. Breathes there a human who doesn't kind of break out involuntarily in a grin when the sun comes out from behind the clouds and hits them in the shoulder blades? Literally, people, maybe even people in Seattle, fall into a kind of clinical depression when they go without the sun for too long, you know? This thing that already gives us light and warmth and via photosynthesis our supper is now willing to provide us with all the power we could ever use. And what a gift that is. Energy from heaven, not from hell. It's a powerful, powerful moment. And I think I've really decided to write this book about 18 months ago when we had a total eclipse in Vermont. It was biggest thing that ever happened in Vermont, biggest traffic jam in Vermont history. Everybody from Boston driving up to watch. But everybody was in a good mood, even in the traffic jam, because it was so beautiful. I was on the campus at Middlebury College, and with 1,500 students out on the quad watching this thing happen, and they all put down their phones for half an hour and watched this great spectacle unfold. And it was a reminder of how deep and powerful this connection is. So I hope very much that this is the moment that we decide to try and seize. It would be an extraordinary shame to waste this possibility that we've been given. But we have to push. 30 or 40 years from now, we will run the planet on sun and wind. Economics will dictate that. But if it takes us 30 or 40 years to get there, then the planet we run on sun and wind will be a broken planet. So we got to push. That's why we're doing Sunday, and I really want to thank my colleagues at Third Act in particular for doing so much of the groundwork to make this happen. It is appropriate. It is appropriate that some of us people of a certain age are engaged in this work, because if you're 70 now, something like 85% of all the carbon in the atmosphere has been emitted in your lifetime. And the thing we need to do now is whatever we can to try and turn that around. So somebody will tell us in a minute, I think, where on Sunday people should be in Seattle. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides. You'll see the logo there that we chose for Sunday, this half a sun, to symbolize the fact that we're halfway there. We have the technology. We require the political will. The next slide shows just a few of the 10,000 or so drawings of that sun that people have made. And if you go to sunday.earth, you can add your own to this huge global gallery that's shown up. And I think the last slide shows the one that my friend Jane Fonda sent us in from the Amazon when we were first starting this. She was down there raising money to save the rainforest and sent us that right away. It's going to be a beautiful day. We need it to be a powerful day. And so we're very, very grateful to everyone who's helping and taking part. And I'll just say at the end what I said at the beginning. I wake up at 3 in the morning, too many mornings, worried about what's happening on our planet and in our country. This is a tremendously dark moment, darkest moment of my life. But there is this one profound ray of sun shining at this time. It illuminates a path forward. Let's try and take it. Thank you all very much.
All right, Bill.
What a pleasure to see you, man.
It's great to see you too.
And so many thanks for the work you do at GRIST. That's another one of the Seattle institutions that has huge and palpable influence across the planet.
Oh. I appreciate that, Bill, just as much as I appreciated your wonderful talk. It was really, really galvanizing. And before we go any further, I should actually say thank you, because you did acknowledge GRIST at the end of your book, which is a great honor. So I really, really appreciate that. I want to encourage folks to add their questions to the queue here. We're going to do a Q&A for about half an hour. And if it's okay, I'm going to start with a couple of questions of my own. And one of them is that a key detail in the opening of the book that I feel like I lost and then was reminded of at the end of the book is that you actually didn't start writing this until after the election, which I know that you're, nearly 24 books in, and so it's less of a lift for you than it is for me. It would probably take a decade. But I just want to go back to April of last year, the eclipse day, when you decided to write a book venerating the sun and its ability to provide all the energy we need. And then another snapshot at the moment when you were writing the book, in the process of writing the book, because at least from a political standpoint in the US, the chessboard was effectively toppled.
Yep. It's one of the reasons that I'm glad that I've learned over the years to think globally. When we founded 350.org, it was precisely so that we could work around the world, and we've organized 20,000 demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea. So I have friends and colleagues across the planet and a good sense of how things are playing out, and that makes it a little bit easier to absorb what's happening here, although in some ways it makes it all the more maddening. Mm-hmm. The idea that America is just completely surrendering the future to China in the course of 6 months is historians will one day regard as one of the strangest things that's ever happened on the planet. But yes, it's good to know that this is happening elsewhere. And that gives one some faith that eventually, or really simultaneously, we'll be able to keep it happening here. In part because at a certain point, not very far away, the comparative disadvantage of trying to run our economy on expensive energy while the rest of the world is running their economy on cheap energy will become deeply, deeply apparent. I mean, you can construct a thing where, MAGA keeps control of America for a decade, at the end of which time, if we're still allowing tourists to get visas to come visit, they will arrive on our shores to look at the kind of colonial Williamsburg of internal combustion, to see how people did things in the olden times, But hopefully that won't be the fate of things. Hopefully we will be able, that's why we do things like Sunday, to try and make sure. And by the way, somebody who knows where everybody in Seattle should be on Sunday should type it into whatever pad you have there so we can do a little organizing here and make sure that people know where to go. Or shout it out, one or the other.
And I do want to pick up on the piece about China, because while the main character in the book, from my perspective, is the solar panel, the subtext of it is that, as you noted in your talk, China is going to be the first electrostate, and in 30 to 40 years, economics are going to dictate that what they are spending their time building and have built to this point is going to be the basis of the world economy. And so, have you put much thought beyond the colonial Williamsburg analogy of the fact that this future renewable energy powered world is likely to be one, if we don't really, this is like a comeback, the Red Sox comeback against the Yankees in the World Series 20 years ago. That was for Chip Giller. If we don't execute some sort of comeback like that, we are going to be the failed empire. We're going to be the UK in that world. People are going to come and look at our museum of things that we...
I think we'll actually sort of recognize some of this shift much quicker than that. The next global conference on climate change is 6 weeks away or 8 weeks away in Brazil. And we're not going because we've pulled the country that put the most carbon in the air is the only country no longer taking part in the global effort to do something about it. We're not going to be there, and I think it'll be extraordinarily apparent beginning right then that China will be using this moment to kind of begin assuming a sort of global leadership. I have very mixed emotions about that. I've spent a lot of time in China. There's things about it I like. I also realize that if I had spent my life doing in China what I did in the United States, I would have spent my life rotting in a jail cell. I'm no longer as convinced that won't be my fate here, as I was. But in this sense, China is demonstrating a serious responsibility to the planet, and we're demonstrating at best an extraordinary short-term thinking thing, but it's not one that's going to work. The president has announced several times that what he's interested in is energy dominance, and we're going to control the world by controlling its supply of oil and especially natural gas.
Extremely ironic.
Badly want to export. In the very short run, we can do some of this. The president is using the threat of tariffs to extort country after country into buying natural gas. Our energy secretary was in Europe this past week telling them, A, that the Paris Accords were silly and that climate change was not a serious problem, and B, that they had to relax all their environmental regulations so they could buy lots of methane. In the short run, that will work for a little while, but any rational government any place else will think about it for a minute and decide that in the slightly longer run, they do not want to depend on a country as fickle and erratic as the United States for their supplies of energy, not when they can go buy some Chinese solar panels and then depend on no one for their supplies of energy. Indonesia, fourth largest country in the world, 3 weeks ago announced a plan to build out 100 gigawatts of solar over the next 5 years. India announced 3 weeks ago that they'd reached their 2030 target of having half their electric capacity from solar energy 5 years early, 2025. The handwriting is on the wall in this way. We're not going to have energy dominance over the rest of the planet, and frankly, that's a very good thing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and to your point about each country, not even each country in this future being able to provide for themselves, but communities and cities and regions, etc. There are these terms, these terms that are associated with the political tribes of the U.S. and this. There's a lot of commingling of them, weirdly, around the energy transition. So there's like this collective action idea, which is like tied to climate change and climate action. But in your book, you talk about the concept of decentralization, which is, something that's very, very fond. The folks, the crypto bros, are very into decentralization, for instance. And then there's also, you were talking about your neighbors in rural Vermont, the AR-15 wielding solar panel having neighbors. And then I sometimes think about the congressman from Kentucky, Thomas Massie, who until this year was sort of best known for telling John Kerry that he was a scientist, but John Kerry was a political scientist. He's lived off the grid for 10 years and has he uses like an old decommissioned Tesla battery to run his house with solar panels. So there are all these ways to bring about this change. For some people, maybe for a lot of people in this room, this idea of collective action is, and being able to have community resilience is really important. But I think this idea of decentralization and this idea of individualism or screwing the utility company, that's really powerful. How do we harness all of those disparate messages to motivate different?
Well, I do think that that's important because we really do have to learn in this country to talk across our differences in profound ways. And solar power actually is one of the, when they poll Americans, solar panels, solar power is the thing that polls best across ideologies and party lines. It remains, even after all the work that Trump and people have done to talk it down, it remains very popular even with MAGA Republicans. And I think it's because it has, in part, that, I just wrote a piece for The Guardian last week saying, if you're a serious right-wing prepper, you definitely want to power your bunker with solar panels because it's super hard work to do it with fossil fuel. You have to. I got deep into the Reddit forums, and they're like, "Yeah, I've got my diesel tank, but it's growing algae," and other people are like, "Well, you need this algaecide to put in the tank." It's like. If you go back and look at Mad Max from the early 1980s, okay, the whole plot line is like they're roaming the desert trying to find old oil tankers to hijack so that they can have some more oil to keep going and whatever. You're definitely going to run out of derelict oil tankers at a certain point. But, you know, Mad Max now would just need like 40% of all households in Australia to have solar panels. He would be chill Max, you know, just kicking back and you know, running his stuff off his solar panels. I'm going to do a whole chill Max franchise of movies, you know. And
I'm going to pull in some of the questions from the audience, and because I'm so happy that this person identified themselves, because most of these are anonymous. So this is from a 15-year-old in the audience named Parker Collins. How can my generation help the world when we have no control over the choices that shape it, while people who make decisions don't have to necessarily live with those choices?
That's a very, very good question, Parker, and it really explains why we started Third Act 3 years ago. You know, my sense was that there were a lot of older Americans who would welcome the chance to work together to try and back up young people in this fight. Young people are doing an extraordinary job from Greta Thunberg on down, but it's, you know, not okay to just say it's up to the next generation to solve this problem. Not when we have to do it in, I mean, it's immoral, but it's also impractical because we have to do this in you know, the IPCC says we have to cut emissions in half by 2030. You know, Parker will be maybe governor of Washington someday, but not in 4 years, okay? And so that's why we started Third Act. If there are any people in the room over the age of 60, you're welcome to join us. The very first demonstration that we did, Parker, was because a bunch of my friends from Fridays for the Future, which is the kind of American offshoot of Greta's movement, called up and said, we want to take on these banks that are going after, that are financing fossil fuel, you know, Citi and Chase and B of A and Wells. We want to do this, but we don't even have like checking accounts or credit cards or anything. Can you help? And I was like, well, we all have checking accounts, sure. And the first demonstration we did, it was in Boston, and you know, we got there and there's 200 or 300 high school kids, because high school kids deeply understand the barrel of the gun down which they are staring. And they're also somewhat sprier, so they were at the head of the march. But at the back of the march, there were a bunch of us from this nascent Third Act with a banner that just said, fossils against fossil fuels, you know? The kids who were there were like, they laughed, but my sense from talking to them and many times since is that climate anxiety, while very real, has less to do with actual physical fears about what's happening on the earth and more to do with the fear that they've just been abandoned to figure it out themselves, you know, which really isn't okay. So we've had extraordinary amount of fun figuring out how to back people up in this work. We kept working on that bank stuff, and a year later or so, with great help from people all over the country, Lisa Verhoevic, who's in the room here someplace tonight, coordinated a lot of it in Seattle. We did this series of demonstrations around the country outside all those banks. I was in DC where we had several thousand people. We wanted to shut down the banks for the day, but we've reached the age where sprawling on the sidewalk for 3 or 4 hours is less enticing than it might once have been. So we went to the Goodwill in DC and we got every rocking chair that they had. And that's what we blocked the banks with that day. The Times the next day had a big story about the rocking chair rebellion that was underway. So Parker, don't give up entirely. We're doing what we can, and everybody, you know, do join in. This has become a very powerful, especially right now, because my sense is that those of us of a certain age, we have an even stronger sense of how aberrant and abhorrent what's happening in the country is right now. If you're 23, you recognize that, Trump is a bad guy maybe, but you're you have an N of 2 when it comes to presidents, okay? If your memory stretches back to, Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower or John Kennedy or something, you realize that what we're living through is entirely different from anything we've ever experienced before. I've had plenty of presidents I didn't like, but I don't have any time when I have felt anything like I'm feeling at the moment. So it's really important for people who in their first act were around for the moment of real political, social, cultural transformation and liberation that we call the 1960s or the 1970s, to rely on that muscle memory and do some of the work that we need to do now. And it's happening. I mean, I've been to all this sort of, when we've helped organize it, Third Act, all the sort of No Kings protests and things. And when you get there, there are an extraordinary number of people with hairlines like mine, in evidence. People really are standing up, and it should make everybody proud and motivated to do that.
All right. I feel like anytime you talk about solar and wind, there's going to be a conversation about siting and permitting. And a couple years ago, so my wife works at Mother Jones, and a couple years ago you wrote a cover story for Mother Jones about progressives accepting building in their communities and in their neighborhoods and in their cities. And so one of the biggest challenges facing solar and wind, this is a question from Ross McFarlane. I'm going to push it together with another one. So one of the biggest challenges is permitting. How can we support building clean energy at the speed and scale necessary? And then I'll add this last bit in, which is, and how do you counter progressive NIMBYism in doing that, which is certainly part of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that I've sort of it was one of my tasks trying to persuade my tribe of, overeducated old white people to stop suing to block things that they do not want to look at, to stop suing to block infill housing, to stop suing to block, and it's mostly just by helping people, I think, develop a slightly different aesthetic, about the world. So, for instance, I mean, we all grew up with an idea that single-family house, on its own lot was sort of the thing that one aspired to. But in fact, we can come to realize that a kind of busy neighborhood filled with people doing all kinds of interesting things has a much better, among other things, odds for being able to age in place there, And so it's really exciting to see the kind of proposals that Seattle is working with around social housing and so on going forward. We see things, land use, much of the opposition to siting solar stuff in this country comes from a kind of ingrained sense that we shouldn't be using farmland for solar power. And we definitely shouldn't be using all of it, and we do not need to. Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who's sort of the guru of all of this, says every country on Earth probably needs about 1.5 or 2% of its surface used with solar panels and windmills to produce the energy that we need. Our biggest crop in this country is corn. We grow 60 million acres of it. 30 million of those acres we use for ethanol. We grow corn that we turn into gasoline. That ethanol produces about 3% of the energy used in the US. If you covered that same 30 million acres with solar panels, you would produce 100% of all the energy that we use, okay? We do not want to just carpet Indiana with solar panels. That's not the way to do this. We want to spread it out. But it's a really good reminder that we need just to think a little differently. So I was in a cornfield in Illinois last summer for the book, and it was one of the, for me, it was really revealing moment. I was with a guy who was converting part of his farm from corn to solar panels. He said, look, here's an acre. I throw corn on it, it gets turned into ethanol. That ethanol in a year is enough to drive my Ford F-150 pickup, most popular vehicle in America for 45 years, to drive it about 25,000 miles, okay? Here's an acre over here that I've converted to solar panels. It produces enough electrons each year to drive my Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV version of the same truck, not 25,000 miles, but 700,000 miles, okay? And I don't have to pour nitrogen and phosphorus on it to make it work, all of which wash straight down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, where it produces this dead zone. I don't have to strafe it with herbicides and pesticides, and I have half the field left, okay? Because there's big rows between the solar panels, which all of a sudden are the tabula rasa for a entirely new human discipline that we're calling at the moment by the very clumsy title of agrivoltaics, but learning to take advantage of the fact that when you put up solar panels, you actually do two things. You create energy and you create shade. And on a overheating planet, shade is an extremely useful thing to have. We're really starting to learn how to use it. I was just looking at trials from in French wine growers, grape growers, who were finding that yields on a bunch of different varieties were up 60% in fields where they were growing. Now I'm a beer guy, so this does nothing for me, but it's you know, it's just indicative of the fact that people are learning to graze all kinds of things. In Vermont, where I live, what we've done with a lot of these solar farms is plant them with pollinator-attracting flowers and weeds in between the rows. And the result has been incredible. An increase of about 100 times in the number of pollinating insects that they attract compared with the cornfield that was there before, 100 times more, which means that all the surrounding farmers are reporting that their orchards have fruit set that goes up 30 or 40% because we're dealing with the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis in the same place. It's a way, all of this is a way for humans to become more creative than we have. We've relied on a kind of monoculture agriculture and a kind of monoculture energy thing. It's all been at a distance. We don't have to do anything about it, but it's destroying the planet on which we live. And now we have the chance to be much, much more creative as we move forward. And I think when we get that kind of thing across, at least some people are able to say, okay, now I can look at this through different eyes. When I look at a field full of solar panels, now I see a kind of responsibility incarnate, you know? Mm-hmm. People taking responsibility for how we live, what we depend on. Now when I look at a wind turbine, I can see the breeze made visible, you know? And I've come to think that wind turbine turning on the horizon is one of the most beautiful sights in the, it's like a Calder Mobile, loose in the world. A new aesthetic is, that responds to the reality of the moment in which we live. That's a really important thing, not to be, because we are at, part of our brain, we're, very utilitarian and whatever cost less, but part of us does respond to strong signals about beauty and meaning and all of that.
So there's several questions here that deal with the rise of data centers needed to power AI. And so the gist of each of the questions is, could you scale solar fast enough to keep up with that energy demand, which seems to be a clear and present danger?
Yes. So first of all, let me say, you all are in the computer capital of the world, so you at some level know more about this than me. I'm so far unconvinced that we're going to see quite the surge in computing that people have been predicting. I think some of these guys are talking their own book in this process. Microsoft is not building anywhere near as many data centers as they said they were going to a year ago, I think because nobody yet has figured out how to make money off this thing that is very good at helping you cheat on your homework, but is, of indeterminate, unclear business value. But let's assume that we're going to build a lot of these things, or some of them. If we do, the only way to power them is by putting up lots of renewable energy. You can't do it. Microsoft said, last year that they were going to buy 500 megawatts of nuclear power by 2035 in order to power some data centers. That was enough to produce 1,000 news stories across America about a nuclear renaissance underway and whatever. 500 megawatts that's how much solar power China was building every 4 hours in May, okay? Not by 2035, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If you want to build gas-fired power, you can't get a gas turbine. They're back ordered through 2030, okay? And they're really expensive. The only thing you can build fast and nimbly are solar farms and wind turbines. So a bunch of people in Silicon Valley last year wrote a paper saying, if we're going to do this, this is what we're going to have to do in order to make it work. Best case scenario, in my view, is we build a lot of renewable energy to power AI, and then decide that we actually like natural intelligence better anyway, and we've got lots of power there left around. So,
all right, you've mentioned a few elements of this already, and this is what would be 9 Q&As out of 10, the last question, but there's a better last question that I'm going to ask you in a minute. And you'll just have to wait for that.
Man, you're setting yourself up for
So the traditional last question is, what is giving you hope these days?
So would somebody please shout out here where the big Sunday action in Seattle is on Sunday? Bunch of churches, right, around Seattle.
Oh, here, somebody gave me a link that I don't know if I can go to.
If you can go to it, go to it.
actionnetwork.org.
You can find out at sunday.earth. There's one of the things that's happening in Seattle is a lot of things in faith communities, which is very, very good. And by the way, that helps answer that question. One of the things that gives me hope is that our deep faith traditions remain committed to work on this. It's kind of a strange thing to look up and realize that the most progressive global institution that we have at the moment may well be the Roman Catholic Church. The new Pope seems to, I'm going to see him in early October with a few other climate people, but he seems committed to this work. And indeed, the Vatican broke ground on a big solar farm outside Rome a few weeks ago. By the end of the year, Vatican City should be the first entirely solar-powered country on Earth. So there are, I think, deep currents, pushing us, many of them pushing us in this direction. They have to compete with the powerful riptide of the fossil fuel industry doing all that it can to save itself. But there are lots and lots of ways to get behind this and push.
Okay, and I followed that link. So St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, looks like it's just north of Green Lake, Sunday, September 21st at 11:45 a.m. And now it's time for my favorite question, so hold on to your hats. Bill McKibben, do you still cross-country ski? It says XC ski,
I
but
do
I figured that out.
Absolutely cross-country ski. That's my vice in the world. And it's deeply related to this stuff that we're talking about, actually. It is my favorite thing to do in the whole world. I live where I live in part because I can do it every day. But it's actually in some ways just the wrong thing for me to, because there's no activity on Earth more exposed to climate change than right. This. And it reminds me over and over again of the fragility of present arrangements on planet Earth. I mean, there's many more important reasons to be concerned about climate change, but I love winter. I love the fact that there is a time in my latitude where, for a season, friction relaxes its remit and we can glide across the surface of the planet. I think it's the most whimsical, magical thing that ever happens on our Earth, and the fact that it's less and less and less reliable, that even in the mountains of Vermont, we're now as likely to have a rainstorm in January as a snowstorm, that makes me sad. But it also makes me, and here's a more general lesson, absolutely committed to the proposition of never wasting a snowstorm. And I think that I believe that we all should be working as hard as we can, and I know that many people in this room are on all these important projects, but I also believe that we are the only creatures capable of, one of our jobs is to witness the beauty and integrity of the world around us. It's never going to be in better shape than it is right now. And so it is really important and really sustaining to be out in that world too some of the time. And it was such a pleasure to be in Seattle today and just get to walk around for a while in the sun. And I've come to have a much deeper appreciation for that. Just the feel of the sun on wear sunscreen, it's a real thing, but the feel of the sun on one's face. We don't really know how people thought about things before they started writing them down, but we can sort of guess. Every time we find a collection of stones on this planet, they all seem to be aligned for the solstice or the equinox or whatever. Clearly, this has been the thing that people were paying attention to every mythical religious system that we know of, one of the first things it had to do was figure out an interesting explanation for how the sun ended up, over here and then over here again every single morning. And people came up with endless beautiful stories to explain how this was going on. Those are the ways we should be living. Those are the things that we should be thinking about and rediscovering. And as we do, we will get to some more interesting way of being human than perhaps the ways that we've been living our lives. So plenty of bad news right now, but also plenty of deep, deep, deep possibility. We don't know how this is all going to come out, so don't give up on it yet.
That seems like the appropriate place to end. So
thank you, brother.